Let me just very quickly welcome our speaker, Helen Foxhall-Forbes. We're very lucky to have her here just before she moves to the center of the events that we're discussing today, or one of the big centers. Helen is professor of medieval history at the University of Foscari in Venice, and she's a historian of the intellectual, cultural, religious, and social life of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Helen has published extensively on this topic, but today she's going to talk about her new project. It's an ERC project, funded project, and she's going to talk about science, society, and the environment, approaches to change in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to talk about my new ERC project, which has only just started. Do I put this at the screen? Is that right? Okay, yeah. So it's an ERC project. Most people come up with nice acronyms that are a word or something. I didn't. Mine's just SSE1K. But Science, Society, and Environmental Change in the first millennium CE. So the project is at Foscari. It was awarded last year, but it's only started on the 1st of January this year, which was partly to do with the difficulties of taking an ERC project that was awarded in the UK to an EU institution it was a very complicated process, and during it, both first the British government and then the Italian government collapsed, which I like to think was a coincidence rather than causative. But it created a few problems in terms of moving everything over. I've only just started, so I'm not going to talk very much about planning. I hope that's okay. I'm going to give a sense of some of the sort of bigger context, I hope, in the way that Peter was encouraging us to think about. And it centres on the project centres on two key questions. So, how did humans experience and perceive environmental and climatic variation across the Mediterranean in the first millennium CE? And how did they respond both intellectually and socially to those changing conditions? So for this project, human experience is really the central issue. It's obviously not the only issue, but it's the kind of key thing that we're starting with, it's the starting point. So the kind of point of departure is that culturally specific perceptions and interpretations of climatic or environmental variation can have significant social, religious, or political implications. So James Palmer has done some important work on this, for example, and I think this is a really important point of departure in terms of thinking about how we kind of move out from here. So this means, as we know, that the effects of environmental or climatic variation on humans are substantially more complex than just a kind of narrative of causation, because they are contingent and culturally specific. So, although the project title says First Millennium CE, we're actually looking at Mediterranean specifically. Looking at the whole world would be great, but I don't think we could fit that into the 5-year project. So, the Mediterranean is an ideal large-scale case study because there's so much textual, archaeological, and environmental evidence of different types, and because we know, of course, that there were complex and multifaceted connections between societies occupying the land surrounding the Mediterranean. So we're using different streams of evidence for this: historical, archaeological, environmental. So we have a team of people who work on different aspects. So that's me. That's what I normally look like when I'm not giving the paper. We have Therese Yek, who's in Tübingen and also associated with the DHI in Rome. And she works on Islamic history. We have Dan Lawrence in Durham, who is an environmental archaeologist, and then Dominic Flagman in Basel, who is a paleoclimatologist, environmentalist. So, together, we hope, we can look at some of these questions. So within the project, we've got one team looking at the Western Mediterranean, we've got one team looking at the Eastern Mediterranean, and then one team looking at Islamic communities across the Mediterranean. So to try to get different perspectives, and people are then taking different approaches, hopefully all interdisciplinary in some way, but obviously people start with their own disciplines and then kind of work outwards. We're also going to try to think about methodological issues, so how we approach the questions that we want to look at using the different kinds of evidence that we have and the different kinds of disciplines that we start from. So, that works. Fundamentally, we're looking at relationships between humans and their environment. So we're privileging human experience, but we will also try to re-evaluate aspects of environmental and climate science. So one of the key things that we're going to think about is how does the circulation of knowledge and adaptability intersect with sustainability and resilience in pre-industrial societies. And this has been identified as a kind of significant challenge for the collaborative study of climatic and environmental change. But I think there's still quite a lot of work to be done here, and particularly in relation to the kinds of intellectual and scientific responses to environmental change in the past. And I think the relationships between knowledge and resilience are essential for examining complex societies and their varying responses to both to short-term events and to longer-term processes of change. And this is especially the case when it comes to crises. That doesn't really relate to anything very much, it's just a picture of a crisis. Something to look at. So, all societies have a repertoire of situational responses that can be deployed in relation to crises or hazards or significant events that have the potential to have and both the nature of this knowledge and how it's passed on can be crucial in helping societies to prosper or to survive significant events or processes of change. And in past societies, as well as in modern societies, some aspects of this knowledge are what we might see as intellectual or kind of scientific. And in the past, scientific may have included attempting to explain the workings of the natural world, or building on a scholarly written tradition of analysis and observation, for example, in response to natural events like earthquakes or droughts. Other aspects of knowledge are perhaps a bit more practical, they might be held collectively. So, for example, knowledge about which areas of land are safe from water even at times of extreme flooding. So here is a non-Mediterranean example. To flooding in York, extreme flooding in York in 2015. The area of Roman York did not flood. Right, so I don't know if you can, I don't know how well you can see that, but essentially you've got the maps of Roman York on one side, and these are the sort of aerial view of where the flooding went. It basically went around the area of Roman York. Now, it's been shown in other examples that there are a number of Roman towns across Britain that were built in ways or in places that meant that they would not flood, even in really significant flooding events, and even when they're built in close proximity to rivers. Now, in a modern context, obviously, part of the reason for this kind of flood is that there's far greater pressure on land and on resources, and there are also increased flood events. So 1 in 100-year flood events now happen more often than 1 in 100 years. But clearly, when Roman towns were being constructed, people did have the environmental knowledge to use to think about how they were going to situate their towns, so that even now they stay unflooded in an extreme flood situation. And this kind of knowledge was important in the past for shaping the way that societies perhaps work, build parts of their settlements. But I think that understanding how the knowledge is both created and passed on is important for us now in thinking about how knowledge and adaptability and resilience are linked together. And so I've got another example, this time from the Mediterranean, but a modern one. So what you can see here is a storage area. It's called an ambari in modern Greek. And these particular ones are in the hills in rural Greece, in Methna in the Peloponnese. And these were constructed in the 19th century. In some cases, at least, they were constructed in response to perceived threats from pirates. Unclear whether or not these were really actual threats, but perceived, in any case, threats from pirates. So the idea was people could store their grain and other foodstuffs there. If pirates came to raid the village and they came to people's houses, they wouldn't find the food in the stores because they were out of the way and kind of up a hill. They're in a remote mountainous area above the village. They can be hidden. You can put branches and things over the whole of the storage area. Now, by the 20th century, these weren't much used anymore, but the memory of them and what they'd been created for was still there in the community. People still knew about them. In the 1970s, they came back into use when Greece was ruled by the military dictatorship and there was a period of uncontrolled inflation. And government wanted to keep the urban population on side, so they tried to keep the price of wheat stable, and they didn't raise the support prices, even in this period of very high inflation. So the farmers were not really getting a sensible amount of support kind of income that went with the wheat. So there was economic instability in Greece. At the same time, there was political instability in the Middle East, and people were very unsettled and on edge, and farmers didn't want to sell their wheat, and they kept it stored instead. So in Methana, they stored it in places like this, these ambalia, because they were worried about inflation and war, and because there was no real governmental support for wheat production. So when the government inspectors came around and tried to kind of forcibly remove the wheat from the villages, they couldn't because they didn't know where it was. Now we can think about the sort of sequence of events that happened from this. In the end, there was a serious bread shortage in Athens that led to riots. The government's popularity dropped. There was another chain of events, including the military government's attempt to take over Cyprus, which was intended to raise popularity, but in fact the failure of that attempt at least partly led to the fall of the dictatorship. So there's a series of unintended consequences here. At the bottom of this, at least in some places, is the memory of a resilience strategy within a community. So a strategy that can be ignored when it's not needed and brought out again when a particular situation demands it. So these ambaria were left unused for a really long time. But when the particular crisis occurred, they're brought back into action as a strategic response. And in this case, the crisis is not environmental. But what this slightly extended example shows, I think, is the way that societies and communities have these range of responses and strategies that can be brought out or deployed according to particular situations. And in this case, something that was initially constructed quite some time before the period in which it ended up being reused. So we can think about what kinds of resilience strategies past societies use and when and why. And perhaps most importantly, in this case, we've got quite a lot of evidence, but when we look in the first millennium, we have very fragmentary evidence. We need to think about how we can pick those kinds of things out from the evidence that we have now. And another thing that I think is really important is to recognise that social or practical and intellectual aspects of knowledge are not entirely separate from each other. Certainly working in a history department, you get the impression that social history and intellectual history are two completely different things. Different people do them and they don't talk to each other. But as I hope you know, intellectuals, even intellectuals, have to live in society and engage with it. And so one example we might think about here is the information that Cassiodorus gives us in the 6th century when he mentions a water surveyor who came to Rome from Africa. So he says that in Africa, the provinces of Africa, the skill of water surveying is cultivated with great eagerness owing to the dryness of the region. And he doesn't actually, in this letter, talk very much about the particular water surveyor or what he's doing at all. But he shows off, on behalf of Theodoric, his knowledge about the craft of water surveying. So he says, this craft comes to us already approved, having been set forth in the books of the ancients. So he properly infers the proximity of water by the signs of green growth and the height of trees. In those lands where fresh waters are not far underground, the fruitfulness of certain shoots always responds favourably, such as water-thriving grass, the hollow reed, the hardy blackberry, the happy willow, the verdant poplar tree, and other kinds of trees. And then after a load of other stuff, he tells us where he gets his information. This knowledge was passed down fittingly to subsequent scholars by a certain man among the Greeks and by Marcellus among the Latins, who carefully treated not only subterranean streams, but also the location of wells. Now, one of the things that we will also try to think about is how people use that kind of knowledge, right? So what Cassiodorus says can prompt us to think about how and why certain kinds of knowledge are passed on. So as well as thinking about where changing environmental or climatic conditions may have affected the kinds of things that people talk about. We also want to ascertain where it makes no difference at all, right? So we shouldn't assume that this is always really important. And some knowledge, for example, about growing crops or how to manage drought or explanations of natural phenomena, is just repeated as fact, not because of the effects of particular environmental conditions or on the accuracy of the relevance of the information. In fact, in some cases, it's repeated despite that. So people carry on passing on this information, even when it is not necessarily actually very helpful. But this is really important in terms of thinking about the development of contemporary scientific thought and the extent of its relationship to external environmental factors. So one of the things that we're going to do is to explore how knowledge about the natural world was observed and discussed, and then also how it circulated within different cultures and different geographical areas, and then at different times. So that's why we've got this kind of West and East, and then sort of cross-cultural Islamic culture within the project. One of the key issues that we're already aware is potentially a problem is that of scale. And that is in relation to geography and chronology and the surviving evidence in general, particularly in terms of granularity. So we chose to cover the whole of the first millennium because anything smaller than this is difficult to make sense of in terms of climatic variation. But it's very large for historically focused research. And we also have to deal with the fact that often the large-scale changes in climate, which are evidenced through different kinds of proxy data, are difficult to pin down regionally. That is, what we get from one place may not necessarily be super reflective of what we get from somewhere else. So broad trends might offer a helpful picture in general, but local environmental conditions are not all affected equally by larger scale change. So sort of essentially thinking about how we stick all the different pieces of evidence together is one of the things that we're going to wrestle with, I think. And fitting human experience into this is another challenge. So modern scientific techniques mean that we can now articulate the linkages governing global climate and local environmental effects in different ways. Obviously, people in pre-modern societies couldn't examine or observe these very long-term processes and slower processes of climatic change, even if these could potentially have significant effects, and even if some of them were potentially quite dramatic, like the late Antiquity Ice Age. But even if individuals in the first millennium CE couldn't identify long-term climatic variability, they could be aware, obviously, of shorter-term fluctuations like wetter or colder periods within their own lifetimes, or within the collective memory of their community. And this is interesting thinking also in relation to what Peter was saying before about kind of memory of different responses to the plague. What this means then is that at the scale of human lived experience, environmental variation is usually more significant than climatic variation because it's more clearly observable and has more obvious and identifiable effects. So this is why the project is primarily concerned with environment rather than climate, although they're of course not unrelated. And we also need to remember that local and regional environmental variation can be caused by other kinds of things like volcanic eruptions or earthquakes or whatever that are not climatically, what's the word I want? They don't necessarily originate in climate, they can, but don't have to. So that's a very brief sort of outline of what we're going to do in the project, I hope. So I just want to turn now to a few examples that got me thinking about this. I don't have any, I suppose I don't have any very dramatic argument here, except to say that I think this is interesting, and I hope it will become more interesting as we go through the project. So I hope you agree, but tell me if you don't. So, a well-known passage from Gregory of Tours' Histories, which he uses to introduce the events describing surrounding the appointment of Gregory the Great as Pope. So he describes flooding in Rome in 589. And he wasn't in Rome himself, but he had an eyewitness, his deacon Agios, who'd been in Rome at the time. So he says that in the previous year, so in 589, in November, the river Tiber had covered the city of Rome with such a flood that ancient buildings had fallen down, the church's granaries were destroyed, and some thousands of measures of wheat had perished. And also a multitude of snakes with a large dragon the size of a stout tree came down through the course of the river to the sea. But these beasts were choked among the salty waves of the stirred up sea and were thrown up on the shore. And a pestilence followed from this moment, or this sign, which they call inguinaria. This is my favourite bit of Gregory's talk ever, partly because the obvious implication is that these are freshwater dragons and snakes because they drown in the sea, so they're not saltwater dragons. It's not immediately obvious what these are meant to be about. What I think is important here is the way that he says that a pestilence followed. But exactly what he says here is a bit uncertain. He uses the word vestigium, and that can be a moment. He could be saying a pestilence followed from this moment perhaps when the snakes come down the river. But it can be a sign. So perhaps the snakes are a sign, and they're following from this. He calls the pestilence inguinaria, which is a slightly weird word, but it's often used to describe bubonic plague, but people do mention it. Now, in this case, like so many in late antique history, we can't reconstruct what actually happened, right? It's not very helpful to figure out whether the dragon or the snakes were real, or whether it was just a tree and somebody went, "Whoa, that looks like a dragon," or that isn't going to help us figure out what's going on. What's important is that in Gregory's mind, there is a connection between the appearance of these animals and the outbreak of plague. And for him, this offers an explanation. So this isn't a coincidence, there is causality. And when we look at his other writings, it's clear that he's interested in the natural world and in explaining it, but he also wants to kind of read the natural world for science. So book 10 of the histories contains a whole series of reports of unusual natural events, and it offers a sense of the kind of unsteadiness of the more contemporary world that he reports on, reflected in the natural world, as James has argued, in comparison with, say, some of the earlier books of the histories that he's talking about. And we also know that Gregory undertook observations and experiments relating to the natural world, and particularly to celestial phenomena. So this is a particular interest of his. Gregory wants to explain what's going on around him. But this connection is really important, I think. There's this effort to explain in some kind of, perhaps scientific, perhaps religious, certainly intellectual way, what is going on. But Gregory's not alone in this. And I think one of the most interesting examples here is this very famous letter from the Barrier, where Cassiodorus describes what's now understood to be the early part of the late Antique Little Ice Age. He says that the sun has not shone properly for a long time. So he says, together we all see a kind of blue-coloured sun. We marvel that physical bodies lack shadows at midday, and that the strength of the sun's fullest exposure reaches only the dullness of tepidity. This hasn't happened in the momentary time of an eclipse, but has been going on equally for almost the entire year. And he also talks about the effect that this had on the harvest and the seasons. He says everything in the seasons has been messed up. It doesn't rain when it should, there isn't sun when there should be, nothing's working, and so the harvest fails. That's fine, that's very useful, that's very interesting. But there are two other things about the letter that I think are really important. The first, the advice that he gives to his recipient, Ambrosius. So he acknowledges that this period of time is unsettling and uncertain. He says, in case the present circumstance torments you with great hesitation, return to a consideration of the nature of things, and let what seems uncertain to the gaping crowd become understandable by reason. So I think what he's saying here is that what is uncertain to people in general becomes understandable to someone educated, at least, if you examine this in a kind of rational, quote-unquote, way, using reason. And so precisely in the context of significant environmental change, Cassiodorus advocates an intellectual response, which is grounded in a kind of rational study. And the second is what he then goes on to do in the letter, which is to try to explain the situation in terms of contemporary scientific knowledge. He draws on ideas from Roman cosmology to try to understand why it is that the sun is barely visible and why everything is colder. So particularly, he says the matter of the middle air governs our ability to see. We're able to see through this substance only as much as the thinness of its matter allows. So this great void which spreads in the manner of a liquid between heaven and earth extends our vision, provided it happens to be pure and washed with the brightness of the sun. If it's condensed with some mixture, then, as though with a kind of taut membrane, it allows neither particular colours nor the heat of celestial bodies to penetrate. He also says it's happened frequently in other areas by means of a cloud cover. I don't know quite what he thinks he's referring to. But what's important, I think, is that he takes Roman ideas about the upper air, the ether between the heavens and the earth, and he says this is what allows us to see and receive the sun. But if some other matter gets into this, it acts like a barrier that doesn't let the heat and light through. And I do think it's interesting that he kind of looks to the past to explain and make sense of the phenomena that he observes by talking about this cloud cover that has happened before. The other thing that's very important and I think interesting about this is that his practical response is informed by his intellectual response. So elsewhere in the letter, and in other letters that he writes, it's clear that he says essentially, since this is an explicable natural phenomenon, we can explain this rationally, there are practical things that can be done. So he moves goods around to alleviate the problems with failures of harvests. And he specifically says there is no cause for panic. Though actually the way he says this suggests that lots of people were panicking, which is also quite interesting. But he's just saying, no, sit back, that's not a thing we need to do. Now, obviously, he couldn't know the real cause of what's going on. The fact that he didn't know how to explain what he observed in modern scientific terms is obviously not important. That's not a thing that we need to worry about. But what I think these couple of examples show is how contemporary writers might engage with environmental change intellectually and how that might then relate to other kinds of responses. So this just touches really on a tiny bit of what we want to do in the project, which will obviously cover a lot more than that. And we are only just starting out. Hopefully, in a few years' time, collectively as a team, we'll have something more concrete that deals with some of these kinds of issues in more detail. So, thank you very much.